Hot take, most arguments about astrology aren't about truth. They are about using the wrong system to answer the wrong question. I want to start this with a disclaimer. This is all my personal perspective. It's subjective. You don't have to agree with it. This is not about which astrology system is correct. I just want to share with you the framework I use and how astrology is used and what gets lost when we stop asking what a system was actually designed to do. Over the last few years, astrology has exploded online together with tarot readings, right? Especially on short-form platforms. And with that explosion came a lot of pop astrology on our screens, but very little context. I am first and foremost a tarot reader. I dabble in astrology, but only for myself and close friends that ask me. But I have astrologers in my friend circle and as mutuals. I have friends who work exclusively with tropical. I have friends who swear by sidereal or Vedic astrology. I know people who resonate deeply with the Chinese zodiac, and others who feel connected to seasonal or land-based systems like the Celtic tree calendar. And I don't think these people are contradicting each other. I think they are answering different questions. One of the biggest shifts I have noticed in prop astrology is that almost everything gets filtered through identity. Instead of asking, what kind of tool is this? What is the system good at? What kind of question is it answering? We jump straight to, what does it say about me? Which sign am I really? I heard there are different logics, right? Which system fits my personality best? This identity-first approach feels natural, especially online, but it changes what astrology is doing to some degree. Astrology stopped being a tool for orientation and became a label for self-definition. And once astrology becomes identity, disagreement stops being intellectual and starts feeling personal. And at that point, debates about tropical versus sidereal, real astrology versus pop astrology, or modern versus traditional don't just sound intellectual. They feel like attacks because identity is involved. That is just human. The way I understand astrology is quite simple. Astrology is a language, not a religion or a doctrine. And languages don't compete by being true or false. They differ by what they are good at expressing. You don't argue whether poetry or mathematics is the correct language. You choose based on what you're trying to say. And astrology systems work the same way. They are symbolic languages developed in different cultures at different times to describe different aspects of human experience. Inner pattern, timing, seasons, collective rhythms. And problems begin when we treat one symbolic language as universal, or when we mix multiple languages without understanding their grammar. And that is when astrology starts becoming very confusing, and that is when it turns into what I call aesthetic soup. Aesthetic soup happens when symbols get detached from their purpose, their cultural context, and the question they were built to answer. Instead of choosing a framework, we start stacking meanings over each other. A bit of tropical here, a Chinese zodiac animal there, a Celtic tree symbol. Perhaps we just throw a tarot archetype on top of it, since they have connections to the zodiacs, right? Individually, none of these are wrong, but without intention, they stop deepening the meaning and start just flattening it, washing it out. Because when everything means something, nothing carries weight. Astrology starts feeling comforting but vague, affirming but empty. Not because astrology lacks depth, it absolutely doesn't, but because depth requires restraint. Before we get deeper, if this is any kind of helpful or entertaining to you, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. It very much helps me getting my videos out. Thank you so much, and also leave a comment. I would love to hear your perspective to understand how you use or see astrology. And with that in mind, let's move on to what different systems are actually designed to do. Because when we start asking that question, the understanding shifts. When people argue about astrology systems, there's usually an unspoken assumption underneath the argument that all of these systems are trying to answer the same question and therefore competing with each other. But this assumption is the mistake. Different astrology systems don't contradict each other because they are not answering the same question. Instead of defending or sticking to one framework, I am choosing the tools intentionally. Tropical Western astrology is especially strong when it comes to psychological reflection and narrative self-understanding. So the primary question is, how does the psyche organize meaning and identity? It works with seasons rather than fixed constellations, meaning the zodiac is anchored in the Earth's yearly cycle, the start of spring, the build-up of summer, the peak and visibility of light, the withdrawal into autumn, and the inward focus of winter. Each sign reflects a seasonal condition, how energy tends to move, express itself, or turn inward at that time of the year. For example, Aries emerges at the start of spring and carries the quality of initiation and momentum. Cancer coincides with early summer and reflects themes of protection, care. Capricorn aligns with the depth of winter and emphasizes responsibility, endurance, and long-term effort. It mirrors how people understand change and development, not as static traits, but as phases that repeat in different forms over a lifetime. Because of that, tropical astrology supports reflection on patterns like emotional reactions, self-narratives over time, which is why it integrates so naturally with identity work. It is also important to remember this seasonal logic is based on the Northern Hemisphere, because that is where tropical astrology historically developed. The symbolism makes sense within that context. In practice, tropical astrology is very good at helping people noticing patterns in how they react or relate or make meaning and sense of the world. That's also where things like houses, planetary placements, and aspects matter, not just the sun sign. The sun sign alone is a very small slice of the picture. Meaning in tropical astrology comes from how different parts of life are emphasized, challenged, supported, and houses point to where something is experienced, which areas of life carry focus or tension. Planetary placements describe how certain drives or needs express themselves, and aspects show how those parts interact, sometimes smoothly, sometimes with friction. Taken together, the chart becomes less about labeling a person, but about mapping reoccurring inner dynamics and life themes. It gives language to processes rather than prescribing external outcomes. For example, two people can share the same sun sign and still experience life very differently. One has the sun emphasized in the 10th house with challenging aspects, while the other experiences it quietly through a different house and supportive connections. And that is why the pop interpretation is a way too small piece, right? And that is also why tropical astrology is a reflective tool. It doesn't tell you who you are, it helps you notice how your inner dynamics tend to show up across different areas of life. That is also why it resonates so strongly on social media and in our culture today. Where tropical astrology tends to struggle is when it's asked to do predictions or fate based claims. It wasn't designed to tell you what will happen, but to help you understand how you experience what happens. When it's used within that scope, it's a very powerful tool. On the other hand, we have sidereal or Vedic astrology. They operate from a very different center of gravity than tropical astrology. The primary question for these systems is what is unfolding in time regardless of my preferences? Where tropical astrology is oriented towards inner experience, meaning making, narratives, sidereal and Vedic are far more concerned with timing, sequences, cosmic order. Just to be precise, sidereal refers to the astronomical reference frame that tracks planets against the fixed stars, while Vedic astrology is a broader cultural and philosophical system from India that uses the sidereal zodiac but also includes its own concepts, techniques, and worldview. Other cultures have also used sidereal frameworks in different forms. The sidereal reference itself is not exclusive to one tradition, but Vedic is the most widely known expression today. So these symptoms are built on the assumption that life unfolds in phases that are not centered on personal identity, but on larger rhythms, periods of pressure, expansion, responsibility, and release. In this framework, astrology isn't primarily a mirror for self-reflection, it's a clock. What matters most here is when something happens, how long a certain influence is active, and what kind of demands that period tends to place on a person's life. This is why concepts like transits, dashers, and timing are so central. They describe phases of life rather than traits of personality. Sidereal and Vedic astrology are often used to understand pressure points that require endurance or discipline, periods of growth that come with responsibility, times of contradiction, delay, or restructuring, moments when effort matters more than self-expression. Because of that focus, resonance plays a much smaller role. Something can be astrologically significant even if it doesn't feel validating or immediately recognizable. When people try to use these systems the same way, they use pop or tropical astrology as self-description or personality confirmation, they often feel confused or disconnected. Especially since if you do your birth chart in tropical versus sidereal, you might have different zodiacs placements. But that's not because the system doesn't work, it's because it's answering a different question. Sidereal and Vedic were never primarily designed to tell you who you are. They were designed to help you understand what phase you are in, what forces are active. And when used within that scope, these systems offer clarity and orientation rather than affirmation and comfort. Instead of asking whether a difficult period says something about your personality, sidereal or Vedic would frame it as a defined phase of pressure or responsibility that has a beginning, duration, and eventual release. Once I have seen astrology operate as both a mirror or a clock, it becomes easier to respect why different systems exist without forcing them to compete. And yes, there's more. The Chinese zodiac is also one of the most misunderstood systems in pop astrology culture, largely because it's often approached with the same expectations people bring to Western astrology. It is frequently treated as a personality framework, a label based on your birth year, but that was never its primary function. The primary question for Chinese zodiacs is, what kind of collective time are we living in? At its core, it is cyclical, relational, and collective. It doesn't start with the individual psyche. It starts with time itself, understood as a repeating pattern that shapes social life, relationships, and generational experience. Rather than asking who a person is, it asks what kind of year, cycle, or collective atmosphere people are moving through together. The animals and the elements are not meant to describe fixed personality traits. They describe qualities of time, how a year tends to behave, how energy moves collectively, and what kind of dynamics are more likely to surface across groups, families, and generations. This is why the Chinese zodiac has traditionally been used for things like understanding compatibility, anticipating social dynamics, reading generational themes. A year associated with a certain animal and element isn't saying people born now are like XYZ. It's describing conditions under which people interact, take risks, form relationships. For example, a metal year might emphasize structure, boundaries, while a wood year tends to highlight growth, experimentation, expansion, regardless of the personalities involved. And when Chinese zodiac is reduced to personality memes, people born in this year are like, whatever. It's relational, cyclical logic disappears. The system becomes flatter and easier to consume, but also much less meaningful. And seen within its original purpose, the Chinese zodiac doesn't compete with Western astrology at all. It answers a different question. Not who am I, but what kind of time are we moving through together? Up to this point, we have been talking about different systems, answering different kind of questions, but there's an additional layer. Not every system that assigns symbols to time was ever meant to describe identity in the first place. A lot of what is now casually called zodiac functions differently from personality-based astrology. The Celtic tree calendar is a good example of this distinction. It assigns trees to periods of the year, often roughly month-long, based on seasonal cycles and symbolic associations. But it doesn't map the sky, it does not track planets or pattern. Instead, it maps through seasonal and ecological symbolism. And the question it answers is not who am I? The question it answers is what qualities does this phase of the year tend to cultivate? And what attention or behavior does the season support? Trees in this context are not personality archetypes, they are symbols of conditions. And I have seen people starting tree month as identity labels. My soul tree, this is who I am. But the seasonal context disappears, and a symbolic orientation tool turned into an identity badge. Once again, meaning thins. And the Celtic tree calendar isn't unique in this. There are many systems across different cultures that assign symbols to phases, periods of times, without making claims about personality. They were designed to describe conditions surrounding actions or the tone of a particular phase. They were never built to answer, who am I at my core? When we force identity onto these systems, we are misunderstanding their purpose. Which brings me to my perfect little side tangent. Human design often comes up in these conversations because it borrows astrological elements while placing identity and mechanics at the center of the system. But that means we're doing something different. Human design is explicitly designed to describe how a person is meant to operate. Because of that, it deserves its own conversation rather than being folded into discussions about astrology systems. And when we understand what a system was designed to do and what it was not designed to do, cultural context stops being an abstract moral issue and becomes a practical one. Reflecting a system doesn't require perfection. It requires not flattening it into content, aesthetics, or labels it was never meant to carry. So this was a lot. And this brings me to questions people usually ask after this info dump. The question is, why can't I just mix astrology systems if they all seem to work? You can mix systems, but only if you're clear about what question you are asking. The problem isn't the mixing. The problem is stacking symbols without intention. When different systems are used to answer different questions, they can coexist just fine. But when multiple systems are all forced to answer the same question, meaning starts to dissolve. That's what I mean by aesthetic soup. You don't get more insight by adding more symbols. You get clarity by choosing the right framework for the question you are asking. Isn't this gatekeeping? No. Gatekeeping is about restricting access. What I'm talking about is expectation management. No one needs permission to engage with astrology, but it is fair to say that different systems have different scopes, and that disappointment often comes from asking a tool to do something it was never built to do. Why does resonance feel true even when it's misleading? Because resonance is psychologically powerful. We are very good at recognizing ourselves in broad or emotionally charged descriptions, especially when we already are primed to look for meaning. Resonance tells you what feels familiar or comforting. It doesn't tell you whether a symbol is being used accurately within its original framework. Without study, resonance easily turns astrology into affirmation. And while affirmation can feel good, it doesn't always lead to understanding. Isn't astrology supposed to be intuitive? No. It is not an intuitive practice. It is a study. It's a symbolic system with rules, structures, techniques, and lineages that have to be learned. Intuition can play a role after the foundation exists, but intuition on its own is not astrology. When structure is skipped, it ends up projecting meaning onto symbols instead of understanding how those symbols function within the system. That is why so much astrology online feels vague or interchangeable, because we just assign random traits and use intuition to do the work that study is meant to do. Astrology becomes clearer and more useful when we remember whether we're using it as a mirror for inner pattern, a clock for timing, or context for collective or seasonal dynamics, and actually study the system that supports that function. So, how do I know which system to use? Start with the question, not the system. If you are trying to understand your inner pattern, if you are trying to understand timing, collective atmosphere, once the question is clear, the appropriate framework usually becomes obvious. You don't need to choose a side. You don't need to master all of the systems. There's tons of literature out there that will help you with that. You just need to be intentional. And that removes a lot of confusion. I don't use astrology to define who I am. That also means I don't expect one system to explain everything. Astrology becomes meaningful when it's studied, contextualized, and used with intention, when we are clear about what kind of question we are asking and which tool is suited to answers. You don't need to stack systems to feel more spiritual. You need literacy. And even if you disagree with my perspective, I hope you leave this video with more clarity about how you want to engage with astrology. Thank you for watching. See you next time.